Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 251 of Humanity Rising. Today, we want to contemplate the vastness of the universe. And within that vastness, we want to contemplate the possibility, indeed the probability of life. Not only the probability of life beyond Earth, but the probability that that life has visited Earth. But first, let's take in the vastness. We are in a universe without boundary. There are billions and billions of galaxies like ours, and they haven't, with all the telescopes, been able to find the outer reaches of a universe that is apparently expanding and has been expanding for billions of years. As far as they can tell, most of the stars that they can see with sufficient clarity have planets. In our little galaxy, one of countless billions of galaxies, we have about 100 billion stars. We're an average galaxy. They've been able to calculate that in our Milky Way, there's about 50 billion planets. And of the 50 billion planets, circulating around the 100 billion stars, there's about 500 million planets that are more or less like Earth, about the same size, maybe double the size. But that's the calculation of physicists, given the rather both sophisticated but also rather primitive astronomical capacities that we have. If you really think about what there is to see, we don't see very much. So these calculations are probabilistic, but it's safe to say that there's about 500 million planets, more or less like planet Earth. So if you think about that and calculate even statistically, the probability of life in our universe is extremely high. I would venture that our Milky Way and the hundreds of billions of other galaxies out there are actually teeming with life. Now, having said that, if you assume that the 500 million planets are equally distributed through our Milky Way, more or less like planet Earth, and let's assume that they all were technically sophisticated enough to have spaceships capable of traveling at the speed of light. And secondly, you made even a greater assumption that they were interested in coming to our little planet, which may be the biggest assumption of them all. And that there was a million of them out there. Of the 500 million planets like ours, there was a million of them that had life. They could all travel at the speed of light. They'd reach that level of sophistication, and that they were trying to get to Earth. Our galaxy alone is so vast that one would get here only once in 100,000 years. Just take that in. The universe is teeming with life, almost certainly. But its vastness is such that even with the intent to reach Earth, from a million planets, in our galaxy alone. One would get here only once every 100,000 years. And yet people are reporting sightings of UFOs all the time. So we're going to contemplate this vastness and the probability of life and what it means to humans that, that we are being visited by extraterrestrials. Before we dive into this subject with Daniel Sheehan, who was with us yesterday, let us just pause for a moment. Let us contemplate this vastness from the sanctity of our bodies. Take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes if you can, and just listen to your heartbeat. Your heartbeat is attuned to the vastness of all of it. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to begin by recalling one of the adventures that Danny and I had shortly after we met at Harvard back in the 1970s. I think it was in 1973 to 1975. We were studying together at the Harvard Divinity School. And then Danny was off working as the general counsel for the National Jesuit Office in Washington, D.C. And I joined him shortly thereafter and became the director of nuclear policy, because I was doing my doctoral dissertation on that subject. And I remember one night, Danny bundled me up and we went off to the National Archives. And he wanted to show me something. And he was very excited. And we went in and we went to a little room, and we took out these little boxes, and they were microfilm. And we spent several hours over several evenings looking at this little microfilm. And it was from the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence project. And so we were looking at these little microfilms of UFOs and various sightings and spaceships and so forth and so on. And it was one of the most exciting moments of those times for me, just to get this experience at looking at evidence for actual visitations of UFOs onto planet Earth that were recorded. So it's with great pleasure that I want to welcome Danny back from talking about the constitutional crisis of the United States yesterday to something that he has been passionate about and deeply involved in for many, many decades now. Probably, I would say there's few people I can think of that know more about both the Constitution, but also UFOs than Daniel Sheehan. So, Danny, it's a pleasure. And just talk to us about UFOs from whatever perspective you would like to dive in. It's a vast domain, but let's just dig in.
Terrific.
Welcome.
Thanks, Jimmy. All right. Now, this issue has numerous dimensions to it, a dozen of which come to mind very quickly. The first I have to deal with is that the reason that I'm here today is because there's been a huge surge of interest in this particular subject recently. That just 2 weeks ago on 60 Minutes, CBS 60 Minutes, the kind of #1 news magazine of the major media, had a 15-minute segment interviewing Lou Elizondo, who was the former director of the United States Pentagon secret study of the UFO phenomenon. And they had Chris Mellon on there, who was the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence. And they interviewed a number of pilots, US Navy pilots, that had taken gun camera photos of a number of UFOs, which had caused the United States Defense Department, for the first time in history, to issue a public statement acknowledging, finally, that UFOs were real, that they were not swamp gas, they were not just a reflection of lighthouse lights off from clouds. That had been the cover story that had been going on for decades. They finally came forward in December of 2017 and acknowledged that UFOs were real, that they were craft, there were aircraft vehicles that were flying in our airspace here on Earth, and that they were engaging in activities. For example, they would come from 80,000 feet high down to within 50 feet above the surface of the ocean in less than 1 second, and then stop immediately, and then descend into the water and proceed at up to 200 knots underwater. The timing of this would indicate that they're traveling at some 43,000 miles an hour, and then coming to an immediate sudden stop, and then traveling at almost 200 knots under the water. Nothing conceivably that we have can do things like that. When I say we, I'm referring to our human species, not just the United States, but Russia, China, India, any of the other advanced technological countries on our planet. Because these vehicles have in fact been tracked at faster speeds than the 43,000 miles an hour. They will proceed at extraordinary rates of speed and then turn immediate 90-degree turns and never lose speed. So these are that would subject the occupants of such vehicles to approximately 600 Gs, which would basically turn a human being into soup, actually. So that it's clear that these technologies are something that are so vastly beyond anything reasonably to be expected on the part of any human culture that it immediately raised the questions in the minds of people in the Pentagon, in the United States government, and other governments around the world, that if these are not vehicles from, if we say, one of our adversaries, like Russia or China, however one might conceive of that, and they don't belong to the United States, they're not some ultra secret technology that's been somehow concealed from the rest of the military, then the question has arisen. For example, Chris Mellon, whom I mentioned, was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, both under the Clinton administration and under the W. Bush administration. has said that, if in fact they're not Russian or Chinese and they're not ours, then it raises the question of whether we are alone in the universe. And specifically says that, if these are from some other star system, this presents, from the perspective of the Defense Department, some potential threat in their peculiar perception of things. There's the old Sufi saying that when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets. And so that if you're a military defense specialist, any vehicle coming into U.S. airspace that we define that hasn't been authorized to be there or gotten permission ahead of time to be there is viewed as a threat. That's just how they perceive things. And Lou Elizondo, the fellow who had been the head of the secret space program in the UFO investigation division of the Pentagon, has been quoted as saying, look, as a defense specialist, I have to kind of perceive this phenomenon as a potential threat. But if I take off my military hat and think of this just as a human being, it strikes me that this presents this extraordinary opportunity for our human family. And that's as far as he has gone. Now, the reason that I'm here today and have been interviewed by a number of major news media over the past few months is because I've been retained as legal counsel by Lou Elizondo. That he resigned from the United States Defense Department more or less in protest over the fact that that people were not taking this seriously for some reason. He couldn't quite figure it out. That with all of these vehicles flying around, he had come to discover that the UFOs have actually appeared over the top of U.S. Minutemen missile silos, where you have a dozen nuclear missiles poised to be fired at the Soviet Union or China at any given moment. And the vehicles have turned off the nuclear missiles, rendered them useless so they could not be used, but allowed them to be then turned back on after a brief demonstration of the capacity of the UFOs. They have in fact tracked the fastest jets that we have, pacing them and then flying literally circles around them and then flying away. They have flown around our various battleships that we have deployed around the world, and they've been spotted underwater, going circles around our fastest nuclear submarines. And so that you can see from the narrow perspective of the Defense Department how they become somewhat anxious over the fact that there is this display of technology that dwarfs their supposed superior firepower of being able to establish full spectrum dominance over our planet. But at the same time, this more recent history is what's contexted in the fact that the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee has now demanded that there be a report filed by the United States Defense Department before the end of June, approximately the 24th or 25th of June of this month, with the Senate Intelligence Committee and Senate Armed Services Committee, giving the United States Congress a full briefing on what it is that the Defense Department knows about this UFO phenomenon. And so that I'm here in this context of representing Lou Elizondo, who resigned in protest from the Pentagon over their refusal to come clean about what it is they know about this phenomenon, and it has been involved in providing information which will eventually be presented to the US Congress by the end of this month. So there's a heightened level of interest on the part of the American public and the news media in this particular issue at this point. But it's important to take this in context. As I say, there are at least a dozen different dimensions to this particular story. This one that I've just raised is the immediate historical context in which this issue sort of comes to the fore. But in fact, this has been developing since December of 2017, basically 2 years plus ago, when the New York Times suddenly came forward, and on the front page of the New York Times, above the fold, as they would say in the old paper world of the news media, making it the prominent headline in the New York Times on December 17th of 2017, acknowledged that the United States Pentagon had suddenly admitted that UFOs were real. That began this kind of more current drumbeat of interest in this particular subject. And it took basically a full 2 years plus to get it into 60 Minutes on CBS, which it's probably true that a lot more people read or a lot more people watch 60 Minutes than read a particular issue of the New York Times. So that a lot of people in the country, all of a sudden, just 2 weeks ago, were suddenly surprised about the fact that the United States Pentagon had acknowledged that UFOs were real. This is, however, contexted by a 2009 report from the Catholic Church. The Vatican, back in November of 2009, invited dozens and dozens of the world's leading scientists to come to the Vatican, and then they went out to Castel Gandolfo, which is the summer residence of the Pope. This was under Pope Benedict at the time, to make a presentation to the bishops and cardinals of the Catholic Church about the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence. And this had arisen in the context of another major historical event that has happened in just the last 20 years. And that has, it may sound a little bizarre, but it's only been in the last 20 years that the scientific community, governed by the scientific, logical, positivist, materialist worldview, has even acknowledged that there were any other planets in the entire universe other than those in our solar system. That they have been sort of forced to recognize that there were other planets in our solar system because of the discovery, for the last several hundred years. Oh yes, there are other planets. Some of those twinkling lights up in the sky are not only stars, but they're planets still in our solar system. But up until 20 years ago, because the scientific community had not been able to physically see these other planets around any other star systems, that they refused to acknowledge that they existed. Now, we won't go into the kind of limitations of the scientific, logical, positivist, materialist worldview in depth anyway here, but there are limitations to it. I've said it before. I think I mentioned it yesterday, that the famous story of Oliver Wendell Holmes, where Oliver Wendell Holmes, back in the 1890s, when he was a Supreme Court justice, his wife got upset about the fact that he kept working every day, 7 days a week. And one spring morning, she decided she was going to pack a picnic lunch, and she was going to go to the Supreme Court and get him to come out and take a break and go on a picnic. So she packed the picnic lunch. She went and got him to come out of the court and they're in the buckboard. They're driving out into the countryside of Virginia, and his wife turns and she looks and she says, "Oh, look, Ollie, someone has shorn all the wool off those sheep over there." And he turned and looked at them and he said, "No, dear, the most that we can say is somehow the wool has been removed from at least the side of the sheep that we can see." At which point she stopped the buckboard and turned him around and sent him back and threw him back into the court, and then ate the lunch herself. So that these are these kind of limitations of in that case, the legalistic world is similar to the scientific world, is that they refuse to acknowledge anything being true unless they can see it or smell it or weigh it or measure it, in the physical realm, the materialist realm. And therefore they relegate All other speculation or intuition about the dimensions of reality to this other field that they have historically referred to as the spiritual field, these sort of the metaphysical dimension that is categorically distinct from the scientific, logical, positivist, materialist worldview. Now, this is a long discussion in and of itself, but it's important to note that the crossing of this particular Rubicon took place some 20 years ago, where the scientific community, because of Hubble, the Hubble space-based telescope, was able to discover that when viewing other stars at a distance, the stars that would sort of the luminosity of the star would diminish in these periodic ways, and that they came to realize that it was because it had planets that were passing between the telescope lens of the Hubble and the star, so that there were planets that were coming in orbit around the star. And that was the first evidence that they got that these were planets that were actually occurring. And now we're right on the brink of launching the Webb telescope, space-borne telescope, which is going to have a shield that blocks out the glare of the stars, so that we are, for the first time, going to be able to actually physically see the planets that are circling around these distant stars. And these are being referred to now as exoplanets. Exo, the Latin being outside of, they're outside of our solar system. And they're discovering now, as Jim pointed out at the beginning of our discussion, they're discovering thousands and thousands of these exoplanets circling, orbiting various stars. So this was really the watershed moment, actually, within 20 years ago, when all of a sudden the scientific community was saying, oh, look, there's other planets in the universe besides those in our solar system. And they came to recognize that a number of them, or some 20% of those exoplanets, were within what they call the Goldilocks zone. It means that it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's close enough to their star, whether it's a red dwarf or it's a star of our nature, where there's enough light and warmth that they could have liquid water, which they think is sort of a predecessor to life, at least as we know it. So that these are the watershed moments that have led us here to this discussion here today. 20 years ago, the discovery of the exoplanets, the announcement by the New York Times that the UFOs are real, and now more recently, the acknowledgement by the Pentagon that these are real. But what happened in November of 2009 is the Vatican, in holding these meetings, as a result of those meetings with the world scientists, they issued a formal public statement. Father Jose Gabriel Funes, who was the director of the Pontifical Observatory at Gandolfo, was brought by Pope Benedict to the Vatican, to their official press room, and issued a public statement saying that in light of the discovery of more and more of these exoplanets, the time has now arrived, much sooner than we had anticipated, when our human family is going to discover that extraterrestrial life exists in our universe. And this raises for us a fundamental set of questions. And so the time has arisen for the people of our planet to begin a serious discussion of the profound philosophical and theological questions that are posed to our human family by the discovery of extraterrestrial life. Now, they didn't refer to intelligent life at that point. They referred to life itself in general. But because of my previous service as general counsel to the United States Jesuit Order in their social ministry office in Washington, D.C., I had a certain access to them. So I reached out and contacted Father Jose Gabriel Funes, the director of the Pontifical Observatory, right away. And within like 3 days, I was sitting face to face with him. And I asked him, what are they referring to when they're talking about the discovery of life? Are they talking about just microbiotic life, a very primitive life? And he said, well, really, what we're referring to is another highly intelligent and highly technologically developed, but categorically non-human life elsewhere in the universe. And so that from that point on, it's been clear that the Catholic Church, the largest single denomination in Western civilization, has now issued an official clarion call for the laity of our world to take up this question of the fundamental philosophical and theological implications of the discovery of what amounts to another highly intelligent and highly technologically developed, but distinctly non-human species in our galaxy, actually. And so this is the issue that's presented to us by this phenomenon. But that's sort of the most sophisticated, esoteric, and metaphysical dimension of this issue. There are a whole series of more prosaic contexts that this issue presents itself. In addition to the kind of immediate historical context that I've just laid out, we all, of course, have experienced the long time movie and television history of this issue of UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence. You know, that from the more recent series Unidentified on the History Channel, where there's interviews of all kinds of pilots and scientists and police officers and others who have seen UFOs and have been attempting to report them down through the decades, to, of course, all of our experiences with Star Trek and Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T., the other, and in earlier movies, the Day the Earth Stood Still, War of the Worlds, This Island Earth. You know, there's a whole bunch of them, depending upon how old you are, that you've been exposed to this particular subject for some time now. And of course, there's also the other dimension of the historical news coverage of this particular issue. That all of us, up until actually until 2017, with the front page report of the New York Times, where the Pentagon acknowledged the reality of the UFOs, the news media had been consistently engaged in ridiculing and tittering over any reports of UFOs. The rare occasions on which they would actually acknowledge a UFO sighting, they would all laugh and they would start immediately talking about little green men. And it turns out that this particular attitude that was being displayed by the media, the news media, turns out to have been the product of a conscious program that had been developed by the Central Intelligence Agency, the operations directorate, that had actually issued classified secret instructions to the major news media that they were to ridicule this project, that they were to diminish the credibility of any of the people that had seen these. And this has actually now been proven that Richard Dolan, a major PhD historian at the University of Pennsylvania, had done a major investigation and filed a whole series of Freedom of Information Act requests to the Pentagon and others, and eventually got copies of these internal, previously classified documents of the CIA and the Defense Department, actually ordering all of their officials to ridicule this subject and to even go to the lengths of attempting to destroy the reputation and credibility of any person who attempted to report an actual encounter with a UFO. And so you ask yourself, you know, what's going on with this? Why is the government doing that? And that opens on to another dimension of the story, which of course is the long time cover-up of this whole phenomenon of UFOs on the part of the government officials. You know, that goes all the way to the Men in Black and this whole attempt to destroy people. And of course, X-Files. You know, the whole series X-Files that was on television, you know, shows that there was this entire, they sort of focus on this whole effort on the part of the government to cover up and conceal and obfuscate this entire issue. And of course, there's the Therefore, the actual history of this phenomenon that has been leaking out, contrary to the best efforts on the part of government institutions to keep it secret. And you have the whole long history that the modern history of the phenomenon is generally dated from early in the spring of 1947, when Donald Kehoe spotted, he was a pilot flying in Washington State up by Mount Rainier, and he sighted a fleet of UFOs, all flying in pattern, and he reported it officially. And he was a pilot, Air Force pilot, an officer in the Air Force. And even though he was flying his private plane when he saw this, he was so credible that it was very difficult for the government people to deny this. And so that there began to be a whole lot of press coverage about this issue. And then the big event, and 75% of you who are listening now are aware of this event, that is the Roswell incident that happened back in July of 1947, when a flying saucer, an extraterrestrial vehicle, crashed outside of Roswell, New Mexico, at the 509th Bomber Squadron. It was the only unit in the world that had nuclear bombs stored there at the 509th, and there were UFOs flying around there, and one of them ended up crashing. There's some debate going on whether it was intentionally brought down by some interference in their systems by U.S. military. But in the event, it crashed, and the debris was recovered, and the information officer, Brazel, or excuse me, no, not Brazel, he was the rancher that discovered them, but the information officer of the 509th U.S. Army Air Force issued a public statement. Oh, they recovered a flying saucer. And it went out all across the world. UPI picked it up and broadcast it around the world. It was on the front pages of stories everywhere. But General Ramey, who was the commanding officer at the base, immediately set up a fraudulent event the next morning, displaying debris of a weather balloon, and had a famous picture taken, a photograph that he insisted be put on the front pages of the news media around the country, that, oh, this was just a big weather balloon. And like, the United States military is not able to distinguish between a weather balloon and a flying saucer. But anyway, they put it out and attempted to tamp down that story. But that story has lived on forever, because the evidence of the validity of the crash of the UFO and the recovery of UFO beings from the crash site is so ubiquitous, might I say, that dozens and dozens of witnesses have testified about seeing the bodies, transporting the bodies, picking up the aircraft. Now, I was watching and listening to a lot of these stories, as a lot of people had been, and it wasn't until I was at a conference, the International UFO Congress, back in 1994, because I was representing Dr. John Mack, the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Because I had graduated from the college and the law school and done my master's work, and then started my PhD work at Harvard, that I was asked by Dr. John Mack at Harvard to represent him legally when he was brought up in front of a Rump faculty committee back in 1994 for having published some of his research into this issue of people who sincerely believed that they had had direct encounters, not only with a UFO vehicle, but with actual extraterrestrial beings. And they would, because of the anxiety that this had generated in them, many of them had been referred to Dr. Mack, and he had undertaken a study of these people and issued a public statement, wrote a book actually about this, and was dragged up in front of a faculty committee of Harvard to threaten him and to try to silence him, to stop talking about this issue. And so I was retained to represent him legally. In that context, I've been invited to deliver a talk at the International UFO Congress back in 1994. Maybe in 1995 afterward. But after I got done doing a presentation about the latest information about the confrontation going on at Harvard University with Dr. Mack, a person came up out of the audience and said, "Mr. Sheehan, I'd like to have you come up to my room. I want to tell you something very important." And I said, "Well, let me get someone to come as a witness too." And I got a friend of mine to go with me. We went up to the room, and he said, "Look, I think I have found the photographer who took the famous picture of General Ramey in kneeling down in front of this weather balloon debris, which they insisted upon being published as a cover-up for this. I think I found the photographer, and he might have the negatives of the original picture." And so I said, "Oh, that would be great. If we can find that, what we can do is I know a fellow who is very wealthy and would be willing to finance getting the negatives digitized, so we might be able to blow them up and see." And we did that. It turns out it was the right guy. He found it. He did have the negatives. We processed the negatives, got them digitized, got them blown up, and were able to read the telegram that the general had in his hand. It was so silly. He was kneeling down in front of the fake debris, saying this was a weather balloon, and he had in his hand the telegram that had come from the headquarters ordering him to take the saucer to Wright Field in Ohio and also to bring the bodies with him. And it said it on the telegram. And what we were able to do is focus in on the telegram and read enough of it so that by computerization, we could tell from the wording that you could see how many vowels and consonants would have to be in the blank spots where you couldn't see it. And we actually developed this, and it proved absolutely that they'd recovered a flying saucer with bodies. And so from that point on, it was quite clear to me that the Roswell event was true. So this Roswell event has taken on this kind of archetypal role in the history of the development of the knowledge about the UFO phenomenon. And so we go through these different dimensions of the story, the cover-up, the ancient history of this, if it's true that the UFO beings are coming here. How long have they been coming here? How far back in history do we have any records of them appearing to be here? And it goes, of course, all the way back into biblical references. Ezekiel, the famous incident where he believed that he saw this flying wheel giving off sparks and light in the sky, and it spoke to him from out of the clouds. And there are paintings, there are medieval paintings of the Madonna, with a flying saucer in the sky behind them, and there's all kinds of historical evidence of this. And so what we've come to today, we've come to the point where we're on the brink of a report being filed by the United States Defense Department with the Senate Intelligence Committee and Armed Services Committee right within this month, from when we sit here talking about this on the 2nd day of June of 2021. And there's all kinds of speculation flying now about how in-depth the report will be, what they're going to reveal, whether the Senate Intelligence Committee will reveal this to the American public, or whether the senators are going to try to keep it quiet, et cetera. And there's this huge rush of news media coverage around this. I have to go with Lou Elizondo on the 15th of this month to meet with the Inspector General. Because Mr. Elizondo has filed a complaint with the Defense Department of the efforts on the part of people inside the Defense Department to ridicule him and silence him from speaking out about what he learned as the director of the secret program. So I've got a major event coming up on the 15th of June here, where we're going to sit face to face with the Inspector General of the Defense Department, responding to the complaints that have been filed by Mr. Elizondo, which I've helped him draft and file. So I'm fortunately sort of at the center of this maelstrom going on at the moment about the issue of the UFOs. But if in fact the report, as I expect it will be inadequate, it is filed with the United States Senate coming up here on the 24th or 25th of this month. If it's as inadequate as I think it is, the importance will be is not to let this story die there. Do not let the story just fade out. Oh, well, it was a big nothing burger, the report that's been filed. On the other hand, if there is something in the report that is of substantial, a new revelation of any kind, it's going to fire the discussions about all this. And just last year in October, there was a report that was made to the Senate Intelligence Committee by some of the people that were involved in the study inside the Pentagon. And the head of that group actually told the Senate Intelligence Committee, though it's never been made public, that a majority of the people that were involved in doing the study inside the Pentagon had come to form the opinion that this was an otherworldly vehicle that had come from off-world. And so that issue is that there are clearly a number of people inside the Pentagon that are willing to come forward and assert that, based upon their own highly classified investigation of this, that they've come to hold the opinion that these are extraterrestrial vehicles. Now, this presents a potential huge additional watershed in this particular issue if they take that position to the Senate Intelligence Committee coming up here at the end of this month, and if the Intelligence Committee is willing to make any of that public. So that's how we get here today. And of course, as one might guess, that when, in light of the fact that Dr. Garrison and I were involved in this, looking at this issue all the way back to when we were in divinity school together, you might think that we're interested in sort of the theological implications of all of this, because those are the most profound dimensions of this entire issue. Because if, in fact, we now are on the brink of discovering that not only is our planet not located in the geophysical center of the entire universe, as was postulated by our major institutions up until Copernicus and Galileo, but the fact is that the human species appears now not even to be at the pinnacle of the pyramid of all sentient life in the universe. The major story that is told in our theological traditions, many of them at least, especially the Christian tradition, is that somehow the entire universe exists as nothing more than a stage on which to play out the great drama of our particular species of Homo sapiens, in evolving from sort of the primordial slime of life generation on our planet up into a sentient reflective being that can journey into the stars. Now, that's been the story, and the fact is that of the entire octave of different human worldviews that are operative on our planet, virtually every single one of them is rooted in the fundamental premise that we're the only sentient life in the entire universe. And so that we're right at the brink right now of having to come to grips with the fact that probably isn't true. And therefore, what are the further implications? What role do we have in the universe? What if there are sentient species that their star is a red dwarf, which burns slower and lasts longer and has existed longer than our star? That there are potential civilizations that could be as many as 1 billion years older than ours. They could have had an additional 1 billion years to reflect upon their consciousness, its relationship to the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness that is the source of the material world. And their technology is just one manifestation of the degree of superiority that they have over us. But very importantly, it's important for us not to go through the experience that has been encountered by, for example, a primitive tribe that is discovered, in the Fiji Islands or something, that has never had any contact with the outside world, and suddenly that is discovered by the outside world, and they come to realize that their primitive culture, where they have been, worshiping totems or what else, that their entire worldview disintegrates in the face of the encounter with a more expansive culture that has a much wider perspective on reality than they had. And so the historical evidence has been that on our planet, when a less developed culture is encountered by the more expansively developed culture, the former culture disintegrates entirely because they aren't able to hold fast to the kind of major premises that they had. And so that this has been argued by many people to be the primary reason why our government officials have been concealing the fact of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon from us. But it's not true. I mean, the reality is that when they encountered this technology of the UFOs, they decided that they wanted to get it and capture it and use it to develop weapons. Thus, reflecting back upon the Sufi story of when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets. So that there's been this fixation on the part of the Defense Department to figure out how to capture this technology, back engineer it, and transform it into a weapon that can give us the ability to establish full spectrum dominance over all the resources of our planet. And so that we have to transcend not only that low level of consciousness, but we have to, and here's the more challenging, we have to come to grips with the farthest dimensions of reality that our human family has been able to evolve in all of our 200,000 years of evolution as a species. The very highest, most sophisticated dimensions of our religious traditions may in fact still be primitive. And it's traumatic to us because, I mean, there's a lot of us who realize that sort of the more simplistic descriptions of the theological realm that are designed for children or were designed by the Roman Catholic Church back in the medieval ages, you know, when 99% of the people couldn't even read or write. And, you know, that 99% of the people never ventured more than 50 miles away from the place where they were born, you know. And so there's been an entire set of explanations designed for the masses of people that have been designed by the Catholic Church to attempt to explain to the masses of people the kind of more sophisticated mystical dimensions that are the commonplace of Buddhism and Hinduism, etc. But in the Catholic Christian tradition, they've been into proselytizing and attempting to evangelize people to get them to basically behave, to basically be good citizens, and that they translated all of these esoteric metaphysical dimensions down into kind of civic rules of personal conduct and moral conduct. Not an unimportant service, you know, when you reflect upon it, but the reality is that even the most sophisticated dimensions, Hindus, for example, who recognize that there are some, I think, 232 levels of consciousness in the human family, and that they have a whole sophisticated cartography of levels of consciousness. You know, this is not something new that Ken Wilber discovered. You know, this has been something that people have known about for a long time. But even that level of insight into the dimensions of reality may be proven shortly to be comparatively primitive compared to what is really going on in the universe. And so that's the stage that we're at right now. We're right at the brink of having revealed to us the existence of levels of reality and dimensions of reality that have not potentially even been contemplated by our human species. And so there's this important process that is underway right now to try to figure out not only what the content of this larger dimension of reality is, but how it can be faithfully and responsibly conveyed to people of our species on our planet at this point without radically traumatizing the whole culture, without destroying the economic systems of the planet, without destroying the ethical values of the people on our planet. So there's an extraordinarily important conversation that is underway right now And I'm privileged to be able to be participating in this. And so we've come back together, Dr. Garrison and myself, to figure out how we're going to take up this conversation that we began together back in like 1973. I think it is. What does that make it? Like, is that 60 years or something ago? You know, we're a little older than we look. I know we look quite young, and it's hard to believe that we're that old. But anyway, so that we've come back together again to pick up that conversation that we began so many years ago, to help share our views on this thing with you guys, and have your thoughts communicated to us, so that we can all participate in this extraordinary phase of our human culture.
Beautifully put, Danny. Thank you so much. It has been quite a journey. You know, it reminds me of the famous story of Galileo, also when the church back then was attempting to suppress his evidence, having looked through a telescope, that there were other planets and the sun and so forth. And there's a famous story of him being called into the Vatican, and he brought his telescope. And he said to the priest there, just look. And the priest took the telescope, put it on the table, and he says, if I looked, it would destroy my faith.
Yeah.
And I think you're pointing to a very profound dynamic that's at play, which makes the revelations from the Vatican back in 2009, and now the Defense Department of the United States this month, so important for us all to take in, because we may be about ready to engage in a collective Copernican revolution. Not only that we are not the center of the solar system, the sun is, but that human life is not singular. We're part of a vast mosaic of life, and in fact are not the center of that either, but only contemplating ourselves as a small sideshow of a sideshow. And where does that leave our major cosmologies? Where does that leave our major religious architectures that have been predicated around the centrality of the human being being made in the image of God? One thinks, for example, of the Christian religion, that, you know, Jesus died for your sins. Does that mean he died for everybody in the entire universe, non-human forms as well? What does Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism mean when they're taken off planet and considered by life forms that, as you say, not only are a billion years conceivably, but billions of years in advance of ours, and can display technological prowess that dwarfs us at every level. So I think having you on today has been very important. Let me, you may want to comment on that, but I'd also like to circle back, because there was a number of comments in the chat about John Mack.
Mack, yes.
Who I had the pleasure of knowing too, and several people knew him. And so it might be worth saying a little bit more about John Mack, because he was the one who really took the time to interview people who had visitations. So I think people would be interested in that dimension as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, what happened is that Dr. Mack, as I said, was the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School in Cambridge. And he had a number of people referred to him, because the Defense Department had taken the position that if any officer or enlisted person in the United States military deigned to resist the pressure put on them not to report any sightings of UFOs, if they had pushed through that and actually insisted upon filing an official report of a UFO encounter, they would be immediately ordered to get a psychiatric examination. And this was part of the kind of chilling effort that was made by the Defense Department to quell any of these complaints or reports. And so what happened is a number of these officers had been referred to him to have a psychiatric exam, because they said, well, if you're going to send him to Harvard University, at least it would be uncontestable, about what the results were. And so the bottom line is he had had a number of these officers referred to him, and he had done a full battery of psychological evaluations of these people. And he was surprised, because he said, he actually said to me, that when I did these tests, it turns out that they were perfectly well within the normal parameters of normalcy psychologically. He said, except for the fact that they were general officers in the military, he said. Which, anyway, that was sort of John's position. And what happened is that a friend of his, Bud Hopkins, was a friend of their family, of the John Mack family. Their families were friends, and Bud Hopkins, who was an artist and a painter and sculptor, had taken upon himself. He was a wealthy family, and he took it upon himself to start looking into this UFO issue. So he started referring other people, other than high-level military personnel, to John Mack to have them talk with him and explain their direct encounters they'd had with UFO beings. And at least they sincerely believed that to be true. John started out with the assumption that, oh, this is some kind of psychological aberration. It must be something from their childhood, or they've got parental projections of authority into the, blah, blah. And so, but he was stunningly surprised that these people, most of them fell within the normal parameters of psychological normalcy. And so he started becoming perplexed by this phenomenon. And so he began to, and he made a point, he wasn't hypnotizing these people, contrary to other assertions. He did what they call holotropic breathing. As you know, Stanislav Grof and his wife had developed this meditative relaxation process of breathing that can get a person into a state of mind where they can recall all kinds of things in detail, similar to what can happen under hypnosis, regressive hypnosis, but they're not hypnotized. They're not subject to influence and all that. So the bottom line is he would use this method to get people to relate their information to him. And then so he started this kind of investigation on his own. He would ask them additional questions when they were in this, okay, you believe that you've been taken inside this spacecraft. Look, tell me what you can see. Describe for me the details of what you can see. And they would describe particular kind of instruments and panels and what the people look like, the beings look like. And he was kind of conducting this little investigation in the process of him doing the psychological evaluation of them. So he became fascinated by this, and he wrote an article that he submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine. He was not only the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, he was a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He wrote the definitive psychobiography of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and was a very well-known guy. And so he put together this kind of comprehensive scholarly article to submit to the New England Journal of Medicine. And they sent it back to him, saying they weren't going to print it. And he was all flustered, just upset about this. So he said, okay, I'm going to sit down and go back through it. I'm going to put in more footnotes, and I'm going to, really tighten up on this thing and be really scholastically perfect. And then he resubmitted it to them. And within a couple of days, the assistant to the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. John Relman, sent it back to him. And she came into his office with it still in the envelope, unopened. And she handed it to Dr. Mack, saying that Dr. Relman has advised me to bring this and give it back to you unopened, to make it clear that not only are they not going to publish this, they're not going to read it, right? And so he was upset about this. And so he reached out and contacted a book publisher, and having been a Pulitzer Prize author, they said, oh, sure, we'll print it. So he wrote the book. And they put the title on the book, as they do, the publishers, of calling it Abductions, Human Encounters with Aliens. And it was published. And within days, the dean of the Harvard Medical School came to John's office and said, John, Oh, buddy, I noticed that you published this book. It's called Abductions, Human Encounters with Aliens. I'm really interested in this. I'd like to talk with you about this. He said, look, as long as we're going to talk about it, why don't we have a few of the other faculty members come in and we'll all sit and we'll talk about this. And John said, well, this is great. This is great. I'm going to do a grand rounds on the UFO phenomena. So he goes to the appointed time and place when the dean had invited him, and he arrives there, and here's this panel, this tribunal that's been convened, kind of sitting up on this dais, and you have not only the dean of the Harvard Medical School, but you got legal counsel for Harvard University sitting to his left, and at the center of it is Dr. John Relman, who is an associate professor at the medical school, and he is chairing the tribunal. He's the guy that's rejected his article and said they refused to publish it, right? And so they start to excoriate him about dragging the name of Harvard University through the mud of dealing with such a ridiculous issue, blah blah. So he freaks out and basically reaches out to his best friend, Robbins, his name is. Ron Roberts, his name is. It was his best friend. It was his best man at his wedding, who was teaching in Santa Barbara, at Santa Barbara City College. I was teaching at the time at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and so he had Ron Robertson come over and talk to me and ask me if I would be willing to accept a telephone call to legally represent John in front of this committee. Right? So I said yes. They flew me back to Cambridge. We appear in front of the committee, and right away, Dr. Relman starts to interrogate John again. I said, "Hold, excuse me here." I said, "Just a moment." I said, "I'm not sure what this is that's going on here." I said, "But it's certainly not an AAUP, Association of American University Professors convened panel, because you haven't met any of the criteria. What is it you guys are doing here anyway?" And he said, "Well," Relman said, the dean of the medical school here, immediately after the publication of this book, he started to receive all kinds of telephone calls, and they were asking him all kinds of questions, and he found himself unable to answer these. And so he thought he would have a conversation with Dr. Mack, and as long as he was going to be having a conversation, he'd have some other faculty people. Here they are sitting in this big tribunal, and he's trying to pass it off as a Friday evening salon chat, And so I said, "Well, excuse me," I said, "Look at." Then I said, in the spirit of cooperation on this, then in order to try to be of assistance to you in the panel, can you tell me who was it that called? And there was this big dead silence fell over the room, and they all started looking at each other. And the legal counsel shook her head, no. And Relman said, "Well, I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that." And I said, "Okay." Then in further spirit of cooperation, can you tell me what were the questions they were asking so that we can direct our attention to that? And there was another dead silence fell over the room, and she shook her head no. And he said, "No, I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that." And I said, "Okay, then, well, whatever else, let me just ask this. Is it likely that either one of the two following fact questions are going to be at issue at any time here during the course of these hearings? Like, number one, does extraterrestrial intelligence exist? And secondly, might at least some of these sightings of these UFO vehicles be actually a vehicle from another planetary system here coming to our planet?" And Dr. Relman said, "Well, of course, those two questions are at issue here. And it's totally ridiculous for anybody to believe either one of those things is true," he said. This is Harvard University, right? The seat of the liberal ethic and Western civilization, at least according to their own lights. Anyway, and so I said, "Well," I said, "in that case, then I should be candid with you and let you know that Dr. Mack and I have spent the weekend with Lawrence Rockefeller, and Lawrence Rockefeller has agreed to finance a grand rounds here at Harvard University that will bring in witnesses to be able to testify, the chief investigator of the Federal Aviation Agency, general officers, police officers, high school teachers, we'll bring them in." And the lawyer for Harvard University leaps to her feet and she says, "Absolutely not. We're not going to allow this proceeding to be turned into some kind of a circus," she said. So I said, "Well, okay." I said, "If that's the way you are." So I said, "Come on, John, let's go." And he's sitting there going, "What?" And so I reach out and I physically grab him and lift him out of his chair and say, okay, that when they're ready to listen to the information and evidence on this, we'll come back. But until then, let's leave. So we got walked out. And so I was privileged to be able to start to prepare the grand rounds to Harvard University on the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. So John Mack introduced me to all of his peers. I got to meet Stanton Friedman and Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs and all of the major people, that were involved in this whole issue. And I got to meet and interview dozens and dozens of contactees who had had this direct experience. So I could vet these people and make a decision as to who we should present to Harvard University. Unfortunately, they collapsed in the face of this threat, and they decided that somehow there had been some confusion here. They didn't mean for poor Dr. Mack to get the wrong impression that they were actually accusing him of anything wrongdoing, and they withdrew from the field. So I was made legal counsel for Dr. John Mack's project, now called the Peer Project, the Project for Extraordinary Experience Research at Harvard University. And in that context, I got to meet dozens of more contactees, and I would sit in the circle when they would talk with each other about their experiences, et cetera. And because of that, I was later in 2001 contacted by Dr. Stephen Greer and asked to become legal counsel for the Disclosure Project, which is a major project, and they've interviewed hundreds of people who've had these various experiences. And my responsibility was to vet these people to present them to Congress. And in May of 2001, we convened at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and we presented 21 major witnesses to the staff of congressional people, then brought individual experiencers to meet with their congressmen and senators, et cetera. And then later in 2013, we had a citizens hearing. Steve Bassett helped put that one together, and I was also legal counsel to that, and vetted the people that were going to be presented to former congressmen and senators who all listened to the testimony, and it's all videotaped, and people can get that. I would recommend people get a hold of that. It's on the internet now, and it's the citizens hearings on the extraterrestrial intelligence and UFOs, and it's from 2013 with Stephen Bassett. And it's extraordinary, positive information. And I would also recommend they get in touch with Stephen Greer, the Disclosure Project. He had 100 people that he had interviewed, and they're all videotaped and et cetera. And so people can start to get a view of this. And one final thing for assigned reading for our studentry out there listening, they should get a copy of Richard Dolan's 2-volume study called UFOs in the National Security State. And it's filled with documents that he has gotten, previous classified documents that through the Freedom of Information Act. And it's got all the details laying out the historical chronology of this. So there's absolutely clear data that are available. And because of that, with Dr. John Mack, I've had the great privilege of being invited in sort of to the heart of the UFO issue here in the United States, at least. I've met virtually all of the major players, a lot of the major experiencers, et cetera. And so now we stand on the brink of a major presentation being made to the United States Senate Intelligence Committee here on June 24th and 25th. And we'll see how much of that is going to be publicly exposed, and what role that will play as an early step in getting full disclosure to the American people and to the world about what it is that the United States government and many other governments around the world have gathered with regard to this issue of the UFO phenomenon, and very importantly, the extraterrestrial civilization that is represented by this phenomenon.
Boy, just quickly as we bring this to a close, Danny, there's been a number of questions in the chat about, given the fact that you have sat with so many people over such a long period of time that report encounters of one kind to another, how would you summarize what people have said as a general descriptive of their encounters
Mhm.
with extraterrestrial beings.
Well, very, very importantly, there that that consistently of all of these reports, Barbara Lamb is a very prominent person. She's a professional psychiatrist, and she has made it a point of her practice to be open to clients who have had this kind of contact experience, or at least perceive themselves to have had the contact experience. And she reports that in over 70% of the cases, the people report these extraterrestrial beings trying to warn us, saying that, look, you have got to stop producing and deploying nuclear weapons and having these private nuclear power plants because you're threatening to destroy your entire planet with these. And secondly, very importantly, you have to stop polluting your planet with these fossil fuels of petroleum and natural gas. You're generating carbon emissions into your planet that are going to destroy your climatic system. And it's going to cause a collapse of your entire climate structure on your planet. So these two things, the warning that they're saying is that they're saying that you have to stop nuclear weapons and private nuclear power plants. Is that I mentioned yesterday, I think, is, of the 403 private nuclear facilities around the world, over 100 of them are located within 1 mile of the sea, of the sea coasts. And so that with rising sea levels caused by global climate change and global warming, that these are going to be inundated. And we could have as many as 100 Fukushimas, pouring
Totally.
radioactive waste materials into the oceans and destroying the plankton at the base of the life in the seas. And so that these dual threats of nuclear weapons and nuclear power and the issue of global climate change have been consistently reported by the people who've had these encounters, that the beings are trying to communicate to us that we have to exercise our own responsibility to stop these two phenomena on our planet. And that's a key thing. Now they have not. There's not much of reports at all about them discussing theological issues or giving much information about the technologies that they have access to or anything. There have been some instances of that. I interviewed a man who was part of Project Blue Book, and he went into some detail about the discussion of one of the ETs that had been recovered from one of the crashes, and that he survived and was being interrogated at S4. It's an area of Area 51, Nevada, and that he was relating that they were emissaries, actually, from what we would refer to as God, and that they were emissaries from this high intelligence in the universe, and that they were voyaging around the universe and to come to communicate with individual people from around the galaxy to ascertain the levels of development and the levels of consciousness, etc. And that he actually made direct reference to them being emissaries from what we would call God. Now, this particular individual was a fundamentalist Christian, and he said, well, I didn't believe him, so I never reported that. Which one final, sir, General Bethune, who was the very first general officer commissioned in the United States Air Force after they transitioned from the U.S. Army Air Force to the Air Force. General Bethune was the pilot in a plane that was being flown, a whole plane load of scientists. They were to fly up to Greenland because there were a bunch of sightings of these extraordinary craft flying around. And this is like 1947, 48, right? And it must be 1948 or 49, actually, when the Air Force actually existed. And he was piloting the plane, and they were flying across the North Atlantic going up to Greenland, right? And it's like the middle of the night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, right? And he's flying along, and the navigator looks out and sees these ring of lights down on the ocean level. And he says, oh, wow, look at that. That looks like some kind of a town or something down there. He said, we're not supposed to be near any towns. We're supposed to be over the water. recheck your calibration. So they rechecked, and sure enough, they were still out over the ocean. And all of a sudden, he said, this ring of lights just rushed up, and right in front of their airplane in the middle of the night is this huge UFO. It must have been 300 feet wide, like the size of a battleship or something, right in front of them. And so he nosed the plane down immediately to try to avoid crashing into this thing. And he dove and then leveled off. And he said, wow, this was amazing. He said, look, I better go back and check on the scientists that are back, our pilot, our passengers. He turned it over to the co-pilot, and he goes back into the passenger cabinet, right? And here are all these scientists glued to the windows right along the left side of the plane, staring at this thing, except for one scientist who was standing in the middle of the aisle with his arms folded over his chest like this, with his back turned to them all. And General Bethune goes over to him and says, oh, wow. He said, did you see that? Did you see that out there? And the scientist turns to me, he says, I'm a scientist. I don't believe in those things. I'm not looking. And Bethune related that
back to Galileo.
back to Galileo. That's what I'm saying. So it's not only the religious community that didn't want to look, it's the scientific community that didn't want to look. So that's where we are right now. But I think they're in the process of changing their mind collectively, and are going to take a look at this phenomenon. And we all are privileged to be alive at this particular point in time in history, where we're going to be crossing into an entire new phase of our human family, of being galactic citizens and coming to establish our relationship with an extraterrestrial civilization, and coming to get a better perspective of our place in the ordered structure of consciousness in the universe.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much. I hope we can have you back.
Sure.
Depending on what the DOD report is at the end of the month and what the Senate Intelligence Committee decides to do with it, I'm sure there will be fascination worldwide
for
this phenomenon, because as you're rightly pointing out, the implications of this are in some ways greater than the Copernican revolution.
That's right.
One thing to say it's not the Earth, it's the sun, but to maintain the centrality of humanity, it's a whole other dimension to come to terms with the fact that not only are we not alone, but we're a small sideshow of a sideshow on a minor planet. And what that implies for our religious cosmologies is actually quite profound. And you've opened that subject up to us, and possibly down the road you can come back and just work out the implications for the reality that the human race is now, I think, beginning to collectively face.
Yeah,
it's quite extraordinary.
As you might guess, it's my privilege. I'd be happy to continue our conversation, Jimmy, that we've been having now for like 60 years.
I love you, brother.
I love you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Great.
And we'll see everybody tomorrow on Humanity Rising for, I'm afraid, a much more prosaic subject of public health. But that we're going to need a lot of public health rejuvenation when we all take in that UFOs are real. And what I would love to see is one of them land on the mall. Incontrovertibly present, just on the mall, right in front of the White House and the Congress of the United States. That would be quite a day.
We'll see. We'll see. All right, Jerry. Thanks. I'll see you guys later after the report.
All right. Bye, Danny.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow on Humanity Rising. And one quick note that we're promoting Kate Rayworth's course on donut economics, the fundamentals of donut economics, which you can see on our website. It begins on June 9th. In many ways, it's the kind of economics we would employ immediately and urgently if we took in the warnings of the extraterrestrials, that we're damaging ourselves almost irretrievably by our nuclear weapons but more fundamentally by our complete denigration of the ecology on planet Earth. Just imagine what the wonder of all this could be if we would embrace life rather than destroy it. That's the message of the extraterrestrials. And that's what we need to take in. That's the Copernican revolution of our day. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you here again tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.